almost the most powerful thing is when they come back to the wall and see everyone's fears. And you can see sort of things, lights going off, and people seeing something they haven't seen before about what everyone else is feeling, and that we're in this together. There's this kind of conceit that we're kind of alone in our houses with this, and that's crazy because we're all feeling it. And even the coolest person in the room, or the person I'm slightly scared of, is feeling it. And even the people facilitating the workshop, me, I'm feeling it, and we're not always honest about that. And I find when we are, and we do that in a safe environment, we feel we can do that, something amazing happens.
That's Hilary Gallo talking about fear, up next on the All Things Risk podcast. Welcome and welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. My name is Ben Catania and I'm your host, and this is my show. And guess what? This is our 100th episode. And before we get into the episode, I wanted to offer some thoughts on this milestone. So first of all, I'm delighted and honored to have made it to 100 episodes, and more than delighted that you've joined us for all or part of this journey. So thank you very much. Second, I'm actually not a big milestones kind of guy. I like to focus on process over outcomes. To me, milestones are the byproduct of things like focus, dedication, and passion. But I do have to admit it's nice to have reached this one. Third, what I like most about what we've been doing and what I've been doing is that it's been going on for almost 3 years. And there's something called the Lindy effect, which basically says that the life expectancy of any non-perishable good, like this podcast, is likely to be its half-life. So in other words, we're very likely to be around for at least another 3 years. Okay, let's get into it. Today, we talk about something we all feel, and that is fear. And let's face it, there's a lot of fear in the world. And not only that, but a lot of that fear is just not acknowledged. My guest is Hilary Gallo. Hilary is an author, a speaker, and what he likes to call an enabler. His latest book is called Fear Hack, which is all about looking at fear from a different lens. Instead of fighting our fears, Hilary's approach involves befriending our fears. And I recently participated in an exercise that Hilary led called the Fear Wall. And that involved having all of us as participants write down our fears. We put them up on a wall and we have a discussion about what we see. And I found it to be extremely powerful. And we get into that in this discussion. And we also get into Hilary's background because he was a lawyer for many years, and he got into many years of negotiation and mediation and working in the corporate space. And we talk about that and what he learned in that space, why he transitioned out of it. We talk about fear in our society and politics, the importance of reframing fear, why Hilary thinks we may be moving towards quite a radical and amazing transformation when we discuss an enabling environment. We also talk about the importance of backing yourself and loads of other great stuff. I think you'll enjoy this one. Most certainly an episode worthy of our 100th episode milestone. So folks, here is Hilary Gallo. Hilary, welcome to the All Things Risk podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on, and I love doing these in person. I do some Skype calls, but this is great. We need to have you here in person, so thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Ben. It's lovely to be in the room.
So, before we get into fear, would love to get a little bit of your background, who are you, so that my listeners can position you appropriately. So when you get asked that question, this is my only set question, which is, what is it that you do when you get asked that question in a cocktail party or whatever? How do you respond to that?
I find that a really difficult question, because I think I'm a little boy, really. I became a corporate lawyer. I stepped out of that because I couldn't see myself continuing in that path. It didn't excite me. I didn't really understand why. Ran my own business for a while, went back to a corporate career, became a negotiator, messed that up, learnt how to do it properly, slowly but surely, and got more into the people side of the business, in technology, in the early days of technology and outsourcing, complicated technology and people stuff. And then I left that a few years back, partly because I wanted to get back to, I wanted to do what I really loved, and to get back to, I think the promise that I see when I look at a photograph of that little boy, there's something in that I still think there's a promise and a possibility there that I'm still uncovering, and I think I find that quite exciting. I don't know where it's headed. So that's kind of me. I've had a lot of my life's been very much in big organisations, big corporates. So,
just going back to that concept of the little boy, where did you grow up? What did you aspire to be when you were growing up?
Well, I grew up in coastal Essex, on the Dengie Peninsula. So it's a kind of land of mud where you're not really sure whether the land, that the sea finishes and the land starts. So really impermanent bit of land. I grew up, I spent a lot of time near the water or on the water, and also in the woods. A lot of time in nature. And I think that even today defines me. Fundamentally, I'm quite a outdoors, slightly naturalistic, alternative soul, really.
So the legal profession doesn't leap at me as something that you fell into naturally.
No, it's a bit. I think I understand why, but no, it's not. There's a reason why that appealed to me. Like many, I guess I was good at school, and I think if you're good in that environment and you can work out the rules, you either rebel or you find a way to, and it's very easy to end up to be encouraged, or it was in my day, to be encouraged into a professional career. Are you going to be a doctor, a vet, a lawyer, an accountant? I mean, when somebody first said to me what a solicitor did, his dad was a solicitor, I think, and that was explained to me what these people did. I thought, God, that's something. That's not something for me. And it's odd. That's kind of what I ended up doing.
And many people, that's their story. They have a similar story.
Yeah, and I think I've loved the discipline and the academic rigor and the logic, and there's a lot of stuff about the law that I've kind of still very present in me, particularly when I look across at politics. I can see why those skills they're very useful in life, and they're very powerful. They're just not what drives me ultimately.
Right. What would you say does drive you?
Well, I'd like to keep that open. I'm still working it out, but at the moment, I think seeing someone else come alive, seeing someone literally that moment when their eyes start to sort of move in a certain way, and they'd make a breakthrough. There's something exciting about that. There's something about the power of a room. When more than one person is doing that. I kind of very interested in evolution and people, and seeing people grow to a bigger vision than they had. So I think that's what excites me. I used to think it was conflict resolution and negotiation, but I wasn't seeing enough of that growth in that for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, conflict resolution doesn't. I mean, it doesn't really roll off the tongue. It doesn't sound like two words that really connect to humanity very, very well.
No. Well, I found often conflict resolution was more about helping two organisations agree some numbers.
Right.
And I was much more interested in situations where if you could help two people who genuinely wanted to change and address, the things that were driving them apart, then that's interesting.
Okay.
That's interesting. So I struggled to find the work I saw wasn't of that type. So It was too easy to go and work with single individuals or teams that clearly wanted that. Why struggle when you can? Why struggle to make something it doesn't want to be when you can find what you want somewhere else?
Right. You mentioned that you got the whole working as a negotiator thing wrong initially, and then you made it right. Can you talk a little bit about that as your journey around that and what you learned?
Well, I think one of the joys of being having the role I did as a lawyer is that I was in the room, I was in the transactions, I was trusted, and therefore when it came to the time to really get down to the nub of negotiations, I got myself into a situation where there wasn't anyone else who was prepared to do that. So I took over a negotiation role, and I was ill prepared for that as a lawyer because I was more interested in the detail. I thought that I was right. I was very attached to a particular way of seeing things. I thought I had more power than I did, so I'd end up sort of getting angry, banging the table, seeking to use sort of coercive power that I thought I had. And that led me to a place that it took me a while to realise that both it wasn't working, but also I didn't like the person I'd become. So I then had to look at that, which was it's a professional journey, but it's also a very personal one. Why is that happening? Why am I drawn to that?
Right.
Why do I behave like some sort of, someone who could be a bully or an alpha male or and I think it's an easy thing to fall into. Again, I look across to politics now, and I look across to how we are in Britain. At what I think is a cathartic moment at the end of fall of an empire, the end of empire, where I think there's a lot of trauma around, and it's kind of quite, I want to say painful, but it's quite concerning to me because I can see how I went through that, and I can see others currently going through that.
Did you find that your personality professionally was bleeding into the rest of your life? Was that the part of the trauma?
Well, I think it's very difficult to, if you're truthful to yourself, and you either live a shadow of, not a shadow, but behind a mask when you go into the office and play that out, which I think sometimes there's a need to do that in an aware way, but unless you make a real split, you're likely to have the same things I certainly did showing up in my private life, and I'll readily confess I wasn't. Some of the relationships I had weren't. I wasn't particularly kind or loving or helpful. Yeah.
I think that happens with any so-called knowledge job, that starts to occupy your headspace a little bit, and I find it's really difficult sometimes to switch off the professional side. You sort of having a nice walk in nature or whatever, and all of a sudden something pops up that, I have to do this in 2 days, or this deadline's coming up, or what have you. And I think a lot of people in these types of jobs struggle with that. So it's not surprising, but it is a modern challenge.
Yeah. Well, if you spend all day pushing for outcomes and being very directive and driven, then what happens when you go home? On your however long your commute is to your home environment, and I think that's particular. I've noticed that if I go home of an evening, there's a difference in how I sleep depending on whether I carry on my phone on the train or whether I read a book. Yeah, there is actually a requirement I've noticed to just recover your headspace and regain your composure, and I think that's particularly important before you go to bed. There's a lot of work that says that how we feel before we go to bed and when we wake up are actually critical. So if you go to bed with that stuff on your mind, you're not helping yourself, are you? You're likely to wake up a bit more down and depressed. And I think we're just starting to
understand that.
Yeah, and well, I mean, it's a whole question about how often I'm hearing that some other things happen to some other person. Where they've, I've heard someone section themselves. I've heard people, a father of a, this is going a bit down, Ben, I'm afraid.
It's all right, no.
But, when you hear that somebody has taken their life, or there's just too much of that about.
Well, there's all of this research is now coming to the fore around how social media creates, exacerbates anxiety and depression, and because people, they represent only the best parts of their lives on these platforms, and so it creates a sort of spiral, and our brains, I don't think, have evolved to deal with the technology and what we've created.
Yeah, there's some interesting challenges in that
Absolutely.
space.
So we can get into that when we talk about fear, because it relates a lot to fear. But you mentioned how you made things kind of right, or you kind of figured out the whole negotiation thing, and I'm just curious, what did you do? What are the things that you discovered that were helpful that you then transitioned, or that you then brought to your other parts of work that you currently do? If you can think back to that, were there moments that you said, this has to change, or was it just a slow evolution, or what?
I think there's a mixture of slow evolution, but also maybe breakthrough moments.
Okay.
I think often, so I remember standing in front of a group and saying who I was, and just noticing actually that it didn't, I didn't engage very well.
Right.
And it's because I'd put up a mask of who I was. I hadn't really talked with any real truth. And for example, that was a breakthrough moment when I realised that, there wasn't much depth in my relationships. So that reflected itself into my work in negotiation, because I realised how important I was working on a logical level, and I needed to, if you like, almost like an embodied model of. I was in the head, and I needed to get into the heart and the gut. And I found, once I've done that with people, the negotiation work and the discovery and the questioning and the everything just, it works when you have trust. But you don't have trust through engagement, through the brain, through the head. You have it through a feeling in the gut. And I've had to learn to do that even with people that other people think are the bastards, if you like, the difficult person to negotiate with, that nobody wants to trust. And I've had to learn to do that with the worst narcissists and the most difficult, aggressive people. And it's...
How do you do that with people like that?
Well, I think it's through realising that there's the child inside everyone. There's actually a kind of, I think, well, I certainly see beyond the mask. And I honestly believe, because I've seen it in myself, that there's humanity in everyone. And, people have strategies, and you don't want to get confused by people's... If you only see people's strategies, then you're not really seeing the true person.
No. You're only seeing a part. You're only seeing what they want you to see.
Yeah, although what they want you to see is an interesting way of categorizing, because I'm not sure a lot of those strategies are things that are embedded and habitual, and they are not making a... Right. I think a lot of the time people are not making a choice. That's just the way they show up. But
somewhere they program themselves to do that.
Well, at some point they got programmed.
They got programmed. Yeah. Correct. Yes. Yeah. Now it's fascinating because the sort of corporate environment, you only get to see a certain amount of humanity, and it can create some very it can create very limited views of our potential, of what life is about, all kinds of things, and
yeah, well, that's fabulous though, in one sense, because think what life could be like if we could be more supportive, more genuine. If we could shed that shell. I mean, there's not much of a step now to a world where we get back to something more genuine. And actually, I think all of us would just, most of our best times come from when we're close to that type of way of being. They come with close friends. They come, in our relationships. They come in our families, sometimes. So, I think if we could bring that to the business world, wow. We've got a potential evolutionary revolution to have. I think that's my way of looking at it.
Can we talk a bit more about that? What do you mean by? I mean, you're right. I see it, but and it resonates very strongly with me, because I'd love to work in an environment like that every day, most of the time, every day, all of the time. I think there is something there. You're right, but can you talk about that a little bit more? So in Fearhack, I talk about two different models of power. And so I talk about imposed power on the one hand, and enabled power on the other hand. And I think we experience most of life through a lens, a framework, or a lens of imposed power. That's the imperial problem, the empire legacy. We've grown up in a world which is predominantly about fighting, about coercion, about predatory behaviour and victimisation.
and it's a system that we see the bad things of, whether it's the Me Too repercussions of that. But the simple truth is, it's a lens through which a lot of life is lived. It's a hierarchical world where we see power as something external to ourselves. We very easily become a victim. And it's a strategy, I think, that we have because our minds were born in a time when we were more preyed upon than preying. Mankind was, when we first got this amazing capacity in our heads, we were being chased by lions and tigers. And I think that lens of imposed power is a lot of what the modern corporate world has been built upon. And I think entrepreneurs and smaller businesses today, many of them are building enterprises in a world that I call enabled power, where the model of power is that a recognition that we all have power within us. Power is something we have through the very act of living, and we don't have to relinquish it or give it up. And that world, we see power much more as a living thing. It's like a tree or a plant, it's growing up, it's nurtured, it's enabled, and it's got infinite possibilities. It's more accepting, it's more loving, and I think when you shift, what I'm saying about fear is we can shift lenses. When you shift lenses, the whole thing changes, and that's what I think is exciting.
Can we talk about the origins of this book, Fear Hack, and where the idea came from, and what your vision for this book is? Because I've heard you talk about. So you've written. Is this your second book? The Power of Soft was your first one.
Yeah. So when I went around and talked about the first book, Power of Soft, which is a sort of a slight rebellion at the end of my years of negotiation as to why the hell is it that my CEO doesn't get that relationships are important in negotiation and customers aren't going to do us over. When I started talking about that, it became clearer and clearer to me that actually fear was at the bottom of a lot of this behaviour, time and time again. So I just got more and more interested in what was going on, and I decided I'd like to do, alongside the work I do, I was kind of interested in fear, and then I thought to myself, well, if I need to do that, I've got to avoid taking the easy route of academic interest. I've got to do something that scares me, and so I ended up doing a workshop, which I originally I co-hosted with a friend. And what we set about to do was to explore fear with a series of exercises. We started it as a thing we called Friday Club, got a few friends together in a room. I ran that for 4 or 5 times. And at a certain point, my co-facilitator needed to go off and do other things. And I was kind of thinking, well, I've done this. And I told the group that of the final workshop that I was going to stop doing it, and their reaction wasn't very good, really. It was that they told me that I had to continue, and that there was a depth in this that was only just starting to emerge, and so I was a bit annoyed at that. So I sat on it for a few months, and then it kept coming back. So I decided to rebirth it with the fear being very much in the forefront, but also the idea of doing it differently. I wanted to come at this from a kind of the opposite angle than it had ever been come at before, because I kind of had a rebellion against the whole idea of feel the fear and do it anyway. It takes you so far, but I kind of have felt that just telling people just get on with it, stop being so silly,
and just face your fears,
crash through it.
Right.
That wasn't working.
Okay.
So I wanted to come at it from a different angle. I didn't fully know what that was, but I had a feeling I wanted to treat fear as my friend rather than fighting it. So I literally wanted to put my arm around it, and so that was the hack. And so I started doing it again, and I started doing public workshops again, and started developing it more. And it's kind of gone on from there as a workshop. A couple of the exercises have come out particularly strongly. So there's one main exercise I always do, which is about getting people's fears up on the visible on the wall. And I just have found there's an incredible amount of depth in the conversation that comes about when people see, not only people tend to go up to the wall and put their own fear up there.
Yes.
But almost the most powerful thing is when they come back to the wall and see everyone's fears, and you can see sort of things, lights going off, and people seeing something they haven't seen before about what everyone else is feeling, and that we're in this together. There's this kind of conceit that we're kind of alone in our houses with this, and that's crazy because we're all feeling it. And even the coolest person in the room, or the person I'm slightly scared of, is feeling it. And even the people facilitating the workshop, me, I'm feeling it, and we're not always honest about that. And I find when we are, and we do that in a safe environment where we feel we can do that, something amazing happens.
Yes, and I'm curious about this. The hack itself, because let's take, for example, fear of public speaking, which is, I don't know what every survey comes out. So the top fear, second, or maybe above death. Somebody who has to give a talk and they're feeling quite scared. So what's the hack there? So typically you'd get somebody who says you just have to face your fears, just do it once, and it'll be amazing, or you need to go and confront it. Is that the traditional approach? So what's the hack there?
Well, this is the space in which I'm slightly concerned about having a one size fits all, or even the kind of the book approach. Because at the end of the day, I've learnt that everything is situational and contextual and different. There'll be some consistent patterns, but every situation is different. So that's why the conversation is important, because it's wrong of me to make any supposition about what that experience might be for you or for anyone else. So what I'm interested in is hearing from the person what it is for them, because there's a difference between the person who has anxiety in the run-up, for example. They worry about it, they don't sleep the night before, compared to the person who actually is fine in the run-up, but once they stand on their own 2 feet, they melt. There's different there's a different approach for each of those people, and then there are many people who have different things from that. So it is incredibly contextual, depending on the particular challenge the person's facing.
But typically, what is fear?
It's a good question.
Where does it come from? What?
That's a very good question. Well, I define fear, so I define it as anything that's going on in the mind, as opposed to if a crazed madman's running towards you in the street with a knife. It's not in the mind. It's
real.
Well, it's kind of in the mind because it's in the through the eyes and in the optic nerve, but it's kind of a bit more real. And I think that's the interesting border between risk and danger and managing that, which are more present and real often than fear, which is a construct of mind. And I've had people in workshops talk about some things that felt very real, like being homeless, or being homeless was a good example, and that felt, oh my God, but it actually, when we talked about it, it wasn't real. The person wasn't homeless. They weren't going to be made homeless. They just had a fear about it. It was in their mind, and they had plenty of strategies for avoiding it, but the fear of homelessness was consuming them to the extent that they were almost willing it to become real. And that's kind of for me, that's the difference, because fear is hackable because it's in the mind. And it's like being in a house at night when you hear a noise downstairs. I mean, the mind gives you a thing that's imaginary. It's we could be wrong. There could be somebody downstairs about to come and murder you, but generally that's not the case. And I think this is all very interesting, because some of the people who are the most valuable to society and to themselves are the people who have the greatest imaginations. So these fantastic, creative, imaginative people are probably, what I'm finding, are the people most likely to suffer from fear and depression and all the other anxiety and all the other things that are kind of adjacent neighbours to what we call fear. I mean, because it's just a label for a mind condition at the end of the day.
That's super interesting. And probably at a level, the body doesn't really distinguish between the guy running at you with a knife versus something imagined.
Yeah, and there's something in that which is the origins of the fear reflex. It's interesting that sometimes it's by experiencing our pure visceral fear of death that we get to put in its place the fear of that exists in the mind. Yes. That reminds me of another conversation I had on this podcast about transhumanism, and and it was around these people like Peter Thiel, who wants to discover the secret to immortality, and so my obvious question was, well, isn't death what gives meaning to life? And we didn't answer that question, but those that really are sort of pushing for that type of thing says no. You're going to talk about death now? No. Upbeat, but does death give life some meaning? But at the end, I suppose there's something obviously very real about what our minds create because of that. I mean, that impermanence. Yeah, but I don't think I would question whether we're actually fully accepting that we are going to die. I'm not sure we are most of the time. I think one of our problems is that we tell ourselves we're going to, there's some, optimism thing that kind of refuses to accept that. Right. Because I think the reality is when you do accept it, life does take on a whole new meaning. And when you're prepared to die, I mean, wow, when you've done enough in your life that you're prepared to die, there's some power in that, isn't there?
There is.
When you're ready to accept at any moment. But I'm not sure we are.
There is, right. Yeah, that's a good point. That also when you think about things like, God, how much time do I have here, and what do I want to do, and I want to really live life, and that can be very, very empowering. And we're so insulated from all of that it can take away. Many people, I think, live a very sort of what's the right word? Sort of sterilized life. So it's all comfortable, but it's not really living.
And why do we do that, Ben?
Going through the motions. It's just so easy.
Yeah.
That's everything makes it easy. It's just the default path for so many of us.
Yeah. Well, you look at something like our relationship with nature, the outside, or our food, and I would argue there's a lot of that is driven by fear. It's safe to buy product down the supermarket. There's a lot of food that we think is not safe, and we're told is not safe, so we don't investigate it. If we carry on that way, we'll be eating everything out of freeze dried, and that's the problem we've got at the moment with the gut and the biome, and we're having problems with autoimmune diseases and such because we're not ingesting
real food,
real stuff, because there isn't just bad bacteria, there's
good bacteria.
There's more good bacteria. And actually, if you have a system which has good bacteria in it, it flushes away the bad bacteria. But we're not allowing nature to do that for us. So that's a whole different conversation. But I think there's something.
But it plays in there because where you have the prepackaged meal or whatever, you also have the prepackaged life, the prepackaged career path, the prepackaged whatever. It's and it makes it very hard for people to turn around and say, well, I'm going to do this thing that makes me afraid.
Yeah, well, we want you on that gravy train, I'm afraid. We want you to be wanting that car and that house and that, all these consumer items, so that you need your job to pay for them. You've got to. I would question all of these things because you don't need half of the stuff you're told in your fear that you need, or whatever it is. I mean, I'm making crude generalizations here, and everyone's different, but there's a time for all of us to start questioning that in our own lives. If we've got a problem. I mean, if we're happy and things are fantastic, great. Not questioning that, but I see a lot of people who are not entirely happy, and then is the time to start asking these questions.
What I think is so powerful about what you're bringing here is you're actually giving people some, not just some tools, but a way of, well, as you say, reframing all of this.
Yeah, well, this is a book about fear, but it's also a book about power. It's also about, I have a contention that we're on the cusp of something amazing as a species. I think there's an evolutionary possibility that we're having a retrenchment at the moment, backwards, particularly in the UK and the US, and in some other parts of the world. But I think we're on the cusp of a huge evolutionary step to something that is amazing, and I think there's a whole bunch of reasons why certain factions don't want us to make that step.
Because talk about that a little bit more.
You're turning into Russell Brand on me. But what do you want to know?
Well, I agree. We are when we think about the politics of Brexit over here or in the U.S. with the Trump phenomenon and populism, and when I think about, for example, the whole Brexit piece, one of the things that the Remain side really didn't do very well at all was to, and what the Leave side did very well was to connect emotionally with the electorate, to push those buttons, and not good buttons for the most part, I don't think, but they were able to do that, whereas the kind of Remain side didn't really do that, and I think something similar happened in the U.S. And something needs to be fixed there.
Well, it's all to do with the framing.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, George Lakoff talks about this extensively, but he's right. It's about the framing of the questions and if the right in politics have always been better at framing the narrative, and the left, frankly, haven't got it worked out. And it's you can incite people to war. You teach them to fear. You teach them about. I mean, the take back control is it's just a classic message of that pushes people into that place, and it's about taking, being fearful and separate and taking dominion over stuff, over the world, over nature, over other people, over excluding people who are, at the end of the day, are fellow human beings. And, we're not going to succeed as a species if half of us are impoverished and ill and struggling, while the other half of us, or there's a faction of us that are doing very well, thank you. I mean, none of us are going to survive in that world. But I think they've played brilliantly to those divisive. I call it the monkey in the book. It's the little bit of us that's still monkey that wants to smash to bits the other monkey, and it's really unhealthy, but it just plays so easily, and so that's why I'm trying to call it out and saying, how often is it in business that we hear people talk about fighting? They use the battle
all the time
metaphor, the sales battle, the fight for supremacy, the fight for market share. It's because we're using that narrative to inform. Even when we campaign for, to stop the development in our village, it's a fight, and we're all easily pulled into that narrative frame, and in that frame, fear prospers. Fear will, we can fight it and do it anyway, as long as we like, and but we'll be struggling because. We're kind of, your control and your dominion is my fear, because that's what happens in that world. Systemically, the amount of fear in the system, when you take back control, or you stop freedom of movement, or you impose your will on others, the level of fear in the system's going to go up and up and up. So, that's in a way that's good for consumerism. That's potentially good for the economy in some respects. War is always good for the economy. But is that good for man? Is that man and woman? Is that good for the species? Have we allowed someone to usurp our agenda in that?
Yeah, that's very, very profound. So what is this? You sound quite actually optimistic, though. Earlier, you were talking about a revolution or an evolution being on the cusp of something that's changing. How do you see it playing out potentially? What is the other side? What does that look like?
I don't know, Ben. I mean, I have to be optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's our job as humans to be optimistic, because otherwise we can all fall prey to that. The viciousness that we can unleash. I see plenty enough goodness in the world. The challenge is that we don't, we have a press that doesn't want to talk about it much, because people buy victim stories.
Mm-hmm.
They buy bad news.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's plenty of it out there. Most of society is actually kind people caring for each other, whether it's for an elderly parent or for a young, the young. There's plenty. Mankind is built on kindness and care. Mm. We just don't, foster it and reward it. Mm. What we do is reward the viciousness and the greediness and
I think there's that
the
narrative.
capitalist system. I'm afraid. So that's why a teacher gets paid very little, a care worker gets paid very little. And kind of that's the problem, isn't it? Because if you're a hedge fund manager and you short sterling because, you do very well, thank you. So we profit, we got a model where we profit from war, and we talk about it because that's what's in our popular newspapers. So I think we have to embrace things like Positive News, the magazine for talking about the positive in the world. We have to recognise the people in our lives who do good stuff, because I think there's plenty of it out there. The problem is we're distracted by, the nation is traumatised by Brexit right now. I call it BTSD, Brexit traumatic stress disorder. We've never addressed the split of the 48-52, and whatever it actually is now, that is a split country, and we've never addressed the fears of the people. A lot of the people who voted for Leave, who did so for their own reasons, but whenever I listen to those reasons, a lot of them are based on fear of one thing or another. But we've never really tried to address those underlying. We've got the surface solution that we've offered them in a referendum. We've never really addressed the real issue that's caused that thing, be it concern about housing or education or infrastructure, and how long do we want to blame someone else for that in this imposed power system, where we're avoiding the real conversation about the real issue that sits underneath it, which is we're not addressing those issues politically and not having those conversations about the future of the NHS and the future of education. Why do we let people take it out on this, on the punch bag that's been set up by our politicians? So I can't remember where we started on this question, but wouldn't it be interesting to do something about that?
Yeah, it would be. And
instead,
I some of the things that I see that are happening that do run counter to that potentially is that we've got first of all, there are things like alternative media, or things like podcasts, for instance, and being able to connect to other tribes and other groups of people in ways that we couldn't before. You can set up a small business much more easily now. There are all sorts of new markets and ways to make a living, career paths that didn't exist before. So I think all of that is also happening at the same time.
Absolutely, yeah.
And similarly, we're living longer, we're generally more literate. So I don't know where it all plays out, but there are some countervailing forces that are pretty powerful.
Yeah.
But taking it down to the individual, one of the things that you talked about, I mean, wouldn't it be great if people just felt a little bit better by being less angry and afraid? And I think that's a great thing that people can do, individually. And I think that.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, we can talk in these big global terms.
Sure.
At the end of the day, all we can change is ourselves. It's pointless sitting there and expecting the other person who annoys you to change.
Yeah.
I mean, the truth is, if anything annoys you in this life, it's probably not. It's probably telling you something about yourself.
It is. Yeah.
So, if you're angry or you're made angry by something, ask yourself the question: what's that telling me about myself? Because, the simple fact is, the person who's Zen monk, not that all Zen monks are sorted, but the person who's kind of in that Zen state of nothing, is in a very happy place. Nothing ruffles them. The truth is, if you've got everything sorted, things don't bother you anymore. It's sad, but you tend to get angry because there's something, or irritated because it's telling you something. And I think one of the things I'm raising in the book is, I think we all have our own traumas going on inside us that easily get played upon, and we all get to a point in our lives where we have to, we have the option of saying, what's worked for me to now may not work for me so well. It's causing me suffering or pain or anger or, and I'm sure we can all point easily at people in our lives who we can see are suffering from that, but look at our own lives and say, what's not right? Because the more all of us go on that journey ourselves, the world is by increments getting better. So, frankly, if I can affect one life, that's great. If you can do more than one life, even better.
Yes.
And it's just, so I think we have to start, as Nelson Mandela said, with the bit that we control, which is ourselves, which isn't that great, and stop ranting and raving at the world. Because if we all changed, I mean, the world would spin on its axis, wouldn't it? And that's really exciting.
Yeah, it would do, wouldn't it? And I think one of the wonderful things about the exercise that we did when you taught us when we did that fear wall.
Yeah.
One of the things that I found really powerful was just, as you say, looking at all of the other fears of the group and saying, well, yeah, I've got that too, or somebody who you think has got everything together and they're worried about something, and well, you really you're worried about that. You're I don't know, amazing communicator, marketer, whatever, entrepreneur. Why are you worried about that? So.
Yeah, and that raises the question, why are we not having that conversation? But also, why are we not helping each other? We have coaching and we have therapy and we have, but if we just have that conversation more and are more authentic and honest with each other about, like you're able to be in that room, appreciate that we're all struggling with something, then wow, we could support each other in ways that, I mean, that's what I'm really talking about in the enabled power model is, if as connected beings, we recognise we're all growing and we're all struggling with our own little growth things, how can we help each other? So you help me, I help you. Wow. We're all growing up towards the light.
That's super powerful, and I think, as you say, we're all struggling with something, and I think it goes back to those masks that we wear, because we're always trying to project this sort of air of infallibility, right? Everyone's got a chink in their armor, right? And part of the problem, I think, is structural. that in a competitive organization, if someone kind of shows a little bit of vulnerability, then there are sort of incentives for the knives to come out, and say, well, I can, that person admitted to a mistake, whatever, I can position myself for their job, or I can, this sort of thing. And it does play out in large organizations or small ones. And but what I liked about the exercise that we did is you can kind of say, well, actually, it feels good to help somebody through something that you can help them with. And there is no, this is a totally different. This is a human being, but they've got they're in a totally different story, totally different place that they want to get to.
Yeah.
I'm not, they're not taking anything away from me if I help them, and vice versa. And that's a great place to be able to be if we can slowly get there.
Yeah.
And I do think something's going on with organizations, with large corporates. There was an article in the FT the other day, and if you saw it, by Martin Wolf about capitalism and the corporation has to change. And it's amazing that it comes, the Financial Times had an article like this. This wasn't some, hippie rag or something. It was the Financial Times. So something is happening.
Yeah, we know it's got to be done. We're just struggling a bit with how and the language.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't help but reflect upon, I think one of the things that tipped me over was just reflecting on who'd come to my funeral. I know it's slightly sounds like it's like talking about fear. I say to people, I'm here to talk about fear, and I ask people, who's fearful of that, and everyone puts their hand up. I don't. In the same way, I don't think talking about fear should be fearful. No, I don't think talking about your own funeral should be morbid either. But
or writing your own obituary, or what would you like to be remembered?
Ask
for?
Yourself when you're, fighting for corporate glory and meeting those sales targets and doing what you feel driven by your structural challenges to do. Ask yourself how many of these people are going to bother to take the day off work to come to your funeral, because everyone makes their own choices, but I want a life where, a few more people perhaps might take the time to come and, I find it very salutary when I realise at the end of my corporate life there's not many people there who'd say, I think I shifted a bit during that period, but increasingly I'm interested in doing, not just from the perspective of that, but I just have a feeling that way to go is so much more fulfilling. It's, let's be honest, you get to a point where you realise that all the money in the, we've had this from so many people, but all the money in the world doesn't make you happy. But you notice what does. It's the little moments and the smiles and the, and I know that's what makes me happy. So, maybe that's true for others as well.
Yeah, I at a level of absolutely, it has to be, right. You need money is not this sort of. We need money, right? up to a point. I mean, money is important.
Well, it's currency. It oils the wheels.
Yeah.
I mean, it's our way of organising our lives, but we've there's a danger it ends up as being the main motivator of everything.
Right. Well, it's this similar thing to actually with this article. I'll put it in the show notes, but it talked about the importance of corporations having a purpose, and the money should not be the purpose. It's not really the byproduct, but if you're trying to meet your purpose, then if you only try to just make money, then any organization will just will just float away, because someone will eat your lunch no matter what. You have to have a purpose so that you focus, and I think that's true of individuals as well.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting about Trump's America. I think it's interesting that I think in many ways Trump is advanced from Putin in the power game, because at least Trump won't do something because it's not cost effective. His model of power is more monetary, whereas you look at Putin, and I think Putin is much more about warfare, and power being expressed through the military. So Trump will cancel the military parade because it's too expensive. And in a way, that's progress, because at least money has taught us that there's a different narrative than purely the power of warfare. So in a way, it's on the right. So there is something there that's better than it was, because we don't want people taking us into power is purely, about warfare, and the monetary narrative has helped us. Let's be honest, but it if you make the narrative solely about money, we reach a point where that too becomes bankrupt.
Well,
and it doesn't motivate people, and it doesn't give richness to life, because if everything's about money, you won't attend to the other things, will you? Your relationship with the environment will be of a monetary nature,
and with other human beings as well. You'd be thinking, what can I get out of this person? And that's runs, and when it comes back to happiness and fulfillment, and you don't get that by treating every human interaction you have as a zero-sum game.
Well, that's that's the belief of that system, that everything is a zero-sum game, and I don't believe that.
We've covered a lot of ground, and I know we need to wrap it up soon. But I'm curious in terms of your own decision making and looking at the uncertainties and how you've managed your own fear. What I know you've done something. So you broke out of the corporate space, for example. If you can think back to how you made that decision, what did you do? So what do you remember of that you've taken forward in terms of facing a decision like that, or making a decision like that?
I mean, I went through a period of probably 2 or 3 years where I knew I wanted to go a different direction, which I kind of explored, developed, played with, and had to create a space that I was able to do that alongside what was a quite consuming international career. So I was having to travel and getting the difficulties of that, and I came to a point, it's kind of helped by I've been headhunted into a role, and after a while my boss wanted me to do things I wasn't comfortable with, and I could kind of see the writing on the wall. So I reached, and I had also a potential client, my first client, and I couldn't have serviced that properly. So I took a decision. And I think a lot of these decisions, it's difficult to make a decision to walk out of a very well-paid job to nothing. Really difficult. So I'd put that off. And I did it. And I'd put it off for years, and when I look back, I see that I had a lot of fear about what it would be like, and most of that fear was completely wrong. It was completely made up. I worried about being able to replace my income. I worried about all sorts of things. I looked at it in a way that wasn't justified by my later practical experience. And the whole idea of getting out of the corporate felt to me like jumping out of a plane into thin air without much of a parachute. And that wasn't the experience when I did it. Almost the most difficult thing was writing my resignation letter, because it was a blank sheet of paper. And I literally sat there and thought, what the hell do I write on this piece of paper? But once I'd done that, the whole thing sort of happened. And I woke up the following morning and thought to myself, well, that metaphor I had for how this is going to be is wrong, because the ground is still there. I've still got the ground beneath my feet. I'm still the same person, or I'm still who I am. And I kind of in that moment learnt to back myself. And I think that's the foundation on which I still work today, which is learning to back myself in a way that gives me a connection to who I really am, and a much larger possibility than just fulfilling a job role. And I think, many of us have that possibility at some point in our lives to just back who we are capable of becoming, and our passions and our things we want to do in the world. And I found that, one, I don't need the income I used to have. I can manage without a lot of the stuff I thought I needed. I can support a family. I'll admit the first year was tough, but now 5 or 6 years on, I'm absolutely loving it, and I'm more committed to it than I've ever been. And I see I'm slowly getting to when people ask me what I do, I struggle still, because I'm still moving towards the true nature of what that is. I think there's a lot further to go, and I think it's it's a genuinely exciting journey to grow into that power that comes from within me, and not something that I have to beg someone else to give me in terms of a role or a promotion, or it comes back to a conversation I had. I was at Anderson Consulting, which became Accenture, and I was up for partner one year, and my boss called me into his office and told me that I hadn't got the promotion, and I had the wit of mind to ask him what he thought I should do. And he said to me that, Hilary, if you act like a partner, we'll make you one. We'll have no choice but to make you one. So my advice to you is just go out there, and there are things you're not doing for whatever reason. Get on with them. Take risks. Be yourself. Do stuff that, you don't ask me whether you can do stuff. Just do things you think are important for this organisation. And if you do that, you will make partner. And he was right. And that was a very formative moment for me, of realising, I am not going to sit here and wait for even if I work within an organisation, I'm not going to sit here and wait for someone to anoint me or to tell me. I'm going to just go and do it. I'm going to do what I think this organisation needs, and and there's a power in that. And I think the people who succeed in life kind of work out how to do that. I'm just a bit confused why they don't tell the rest of us, because that would have been really helpful to know a bit earlier. But then if they had, I'd probably told them to stop being so, we kind of need to learn these things for ourselves, don't we?
We do. I think that's a great place to wrap things up. Was there anything that we didn't get to cover that you wanted to mention?
I'm sure there's loads, Ben, but that's a good wrap from me.
Excellent. Well, Fear Hack, where can people buy it, get it? And where can people find you?
Well, all good bookshops should be stocking it. Waterstones have it on their website. My last book was they always kept a copy in a branch. But yeah, this book will succeed, or most books don't sell very many. This is the simple truth, and I'm not with a big publisher. But it'll get in the shops because people ask for it, and it's there on Amazon. It's there on Hive. Hive.co.uk, which is my particular favourite, which is a website that supports local bookshops, and the book is actually cheaper on Hive, I notice. So it's out there on all your favourite mediums. I plan to do an audiobook. I'd like to at some stage, and they can find me literally at hilarygallo.com. I have my own website. And you can mail me off there. Or
Perfect. Wonderful. Hilary, thank you. This was great. I love this.
My pleasure. Thank you, Ben.
I hope you guys got a lot out of that. Check out the show notes as usual. And if there's one thing to do as a result of listening to Hilary, in my view, it would be this. When you feel fear, remember that the mind and body doesn't distinguish between fear and excitement. So you might be on the cusp of something very exciting and something worthy of exploration. So explore that. That is it for now. Don't forget to subscribe to All Things Risk if you haven't yet done so. Just go to allthingsrisk.co.uk, that's .co.uk, in order to do that. And I also want to know a little bit more about what you think of the show. I set up a survey, the link for which is also in the show notes, so do check that out. That is it. We will be back in 2 weeks. Until then, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.